Hello, this is Neville Buchanan from the Northern Kentucky, Cincinnati area, talking to you today about making a marvelous marriage. And this is the fourth in a series of lessons that I have on challenges facing today's families. If you want to have more information regarding these topics, please contact me directly and I will be happy to get that to you. I remember the day that my wife and I got married. We had a very interesting thing happen. We had the preacher not just have us make our vows, but he asked an old family friend who had flown in 20,000 miles from a foreign country to have my parents stand on one side and my in-laws stand on the other side, and they took a vow not to interfere in our marriage. And I remember how precious that moment was to us. It wasn't done in a bad, distasteful way, but it was to remind parents that their children are now making a new family, and they need to love and support that. So many years ago, God gave us this model when He said making a marvelous marriage is a man leaving his father and his mother and holding fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. As I think about our disposable culture, and I remember how different my idea of marriage was at that time, I'm amazed at how far we've slipped even from that time. Staying together for life wasn't something that my culture enforced, but the culture that I was marrying into, that is of the Church of Christ, the idea was that you are going to marry for life, that divorce is not an option. It's one man, one wife for life. And I'm so grateful that that image was in my mind when I got married. It was the idea of receive love, give love, and then repeat, not to see this as something that you can just dispose of if you're not happy with it. I remember when looking at this passage for the first time and seeing the context of verse 23 of Genesis 2. It says, "And the man said, This at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman," that is the Hebrew word Isha. She shall be called Isha, because she was made, or she was taken of Ish, taken of man. And so we understand immediately when Adam is now talking about his wife, Adam being Ish, and his wife being Isha, the female form of Ish, that he's seeing more to it than what we see today. It's like when a wife says, "I will gladly take my husband's name." She's becoming one with him in a legal way, in more than just an emotional way. Psychologist Dan Allender says in his book called Intimate Allies that the failure to shift loyalty from parents to spouse is a central issue in almost all marital conflicts. And so I have focused on this today when I talk not only about taking his name, but leaving the parents. When you walk down the aisle as a couple, you come in single, but when you walk out together, you're telling the world that you are now a married couple and that they must see you like that. And so it's important when you leave your parents that you are very careful with your finances, that you don't again become entangled in your parents' finances, emotionally or physically or financially. Leaning on them in any way should be something that you must try your very best not to do. You must sever dependence from your parental home. I told my children, I have 3 boys, that before they get married, they must be sure to be able to support their spouse, because there is nothing worse than being dependent on the generation that you are trying to leave. This does not, however, mean isolating yourself from your parents. You still are to respect your parents, but it is the idea of realizing that you guys are on your own. You don't have a safety net, as it were. You've got to make it on your own, and be proud of that, and be desirous of that. There are complications, like when you leave a single parent home, or you leave a stale marriage, or where you leave a home that the family was especially very, very close. There's no doubt that in every situation, even in a normal, healthy marriage, there's an extreme void that is left when your children leave. And so it's imperative for the children to realize that the parents will be missing them and will be trying to reach out, but they must leave their parents. And also leaving children. We have in our economy a lot of adult children returning back to the nest. And in these cases, parents need to be very careful that they don't enable these children. Uh, they must set boundaries. For example, tell their children, the adult children, that from 8 o'clock in the morning till 5 o'clock in the afternoon, you will be out of the house and you will be looking for a job. You will not be lounging around the house. You'll come here to sleep. Because you've been out looking for a job. And so be very kind, but be very firm. Be very, very careful, however. The children that come back to the home are emotionally, psychologically injured. They're very, very hurt. And it would not take much for them to lose their sanity almost. And then watch out for reattachment attempts. Parents are going to try to reattach in times where there's a bit of vulnerability. A son might be frustrated in his marriage and he might confide in his mother, and instead of confessing to his wife and confiding in his wife, well, get back to your wife, because at some time that information is going to get back to her. Or a father that sees his daughter, his married daughter, as still his little girl. Husbands, if you observe this, tell your wife. Or a mother is trying to call the shots with her son. Wives, if you observe this, tell your husbands. And then to realign or reestablish these boundaries again, there might need to be a cooling off period, especially over holidays. You might need to visit less. Instead of a 5-day Thanksgiving vacation, make it a 2-day. Instead of staying with them, stay a little bit of distance away. Stay with some other friends in town, or just do things different until the idea is back in play that these boundaries are clear. Also, with the reattachment attempts of aging parents, we have times when parents move back because of illness. It might be that this would be a threat to your marriage and they may need to move into a care center because it won't work well. Also, remember that leaving is continual. When children, in my case I have 3 boys, one is married, one's about to get married, one's still young and on the mission field, but eventually there will be grandkids, and I might swoop in with my wise parental advice, just invading that marriage and giving unsolicited advice and wisdom that can really hurt a new relationship that's getting used to having a new child in the home. And when mothers have these little babies and the baby needs to feed every 2 hours, again that mother is vulnerable, and a grandmother can step in and violate the boundaries. So be very careful. I have a lot of tips also that I've got from the internet, and you can go on the internet and look also at tips about leaving, like being careful of the things you share with your parents. Remember, parents' natural inclination is to stay parents. Leave friends of the opposite sex with whom you've had an emotional bond completely. If a parent manipulates you emotionally, call your spouse in for help. And little things like that. But let's move on to the next topic, which is cleaving. The idea here is almost a glue that has to be in place. The Hebrew word has the idea of let's see, it's dabak, to cling, to stick, to cleave, to hold, to keep close, as in Job chapter 19 verse 20, bone to skin. And then in the New Testament, the word kolao has the idea of glue or cement. This is not as somebody saying, I feel stuck in this marriage, as a fly to fly paper, but rather as a man who is walking on the edge of a cliff and is about to fall, reaches out to a limb. He voluntarily reaches out. It's a desire to voluntarily want to hold fast to your wife. It is the strongest element you can imagine in all the world. When two people become one, the bond is so strong that if one would have an affair or one would leave, it would utterly destroy the other person. It would leave them mad. And I'm not surprised at all when I hear of a divorced person or a scorned wife picking up a gun or driving over her husband with a Mercedes Benz or something like that. It is a tremendous pain that no one could possibly ever imagine, except somebody like me who's a counselor and has seen this pain in so many different ways. And so remember that this glue is very tight. Some of the things you can do to cleave is, remember that, as the Songs of Solomon chapter 2 verse 15 says, it's the little foxes that spoil the vines. It's the little tiny little things, the unwillingness of a spouse to hold tight to his spouse, to have something in his life that is more important, like golf or a hobby, like being in the wood store, a wood shop every day. He comes home and he doesn't want to deal with the frustration of the children, and so at a very early age in their marriage, he will go to the garage where he's made himself a little shop, and he'll start to make furniture and things like that. And it starts off all innocent, but eventually it shows an unwillingness to be bound to your spouse. Think of your marriage as a marriage with your wife and with God as three thin pieces of wood that stuck together with glue. Individually, they snap really easy, but when plywood is plied together, you can't break it apart again without severely damaging it. Even if you put water on it and it gets warped, and one part may look like it's peeling off, it will never come off successfully. And so in 1 Corinthians 13 verses 4 through 7, we read, "Love is patient and kind. It does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude." You can hear the binding agents in each one of these powerful sentences. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Finally, verse 8 says, "Love never ends." It's always going to be there. Again, some tips that I got on the internet. Number one, forge a deep friendship, operate in a spirit of love, understand the need for time together. For example, at our church we have a babysitting co-op to allow parents to keep dating. Negotiate time apart, take action against lust in our culture with all the pornography and stuff like that. Take action against that. Ignite your intimacy, opt for teamwork. It's wonderful for a wife to see a husband, for example, doing the dishes or doing the laundry and things like that. And this is from davewillis.org. These 21 simple ways to strengthen your marriage. Don't keep secrets from each other. Communicate about everything. Argue less. Cuddle more. Don't get deep into debt, and if you're already there, work to getting out. Pray together. Turn off your cell phones. Write love notes. Send flowers. Don't ignore problems in your relationship. Be quick to remember each other's positive traits and quick to forget each other's flaws. Don't hold grudges. Don't waste time and energy comparing your lives to someone else's. Little things like this. Again, cleaving is just an idea of making sure that you place nothing above your marriage. Don't get any isotones, anything that will break the bond. The bond is between two of you. Make sure that both of you keep protecting that bond above all else. And then finally, no shame. And they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. And so you see, there is no shame prior to sin. But then sin came into the world in Genesis chapter 3 verses 5 through 7. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and which was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took and ate the fruit. She took of the fruit and ate. And there you see lust of the eyes, lust of the flesh, boastful pride of life. All three sins come together here. It continues to say, and she gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. And the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together, and made of themselves loincloths. In verse 21 of Genesis 3, it continues to say, and the Lord God made for Adam and for his wife garments of skin, and clothed them. It is sad to see how sin entered into the lives of mankind, how pure they were before that. But we have in the New Testament that God has made provision, and even in the Old Testament, God made provision of marriage, where this purity could once again be there. As we read in Isaiah chapter 61 verse 10, I will greatly rejoice in the Lord, my soul shall exult in my God, for he has clothed me with the garments of salvation. So God clothes us again with righteousness. He continues to say, he has covered me with a robe of righteousness, as a bridegroom decks himself like a priest, and a beautiful priest with a beautiful headdress, and as a bride adorns herself with jewels. And so we see that Adam and Eve knew no shame before they ate of that fruit. But then shame came in, and shame came into their marriage in the form of humility, embarrassment, and guilt. In humility, they hid themselves because they knew they were different from God. They knew that they were small and God was great. In embarrassment, because they saw like the grooves on the edge of a highway warns you that you've crossed a boundary. They saw that they'd crossed a boundary. They knew that they had taken that which was private and made it public, and they tried in their best effort to reverse that, but only God could completely cover them again by making clothes for them. And so we see also the guilt. The relationship has been violated, and it would never again be the same. And so too in marriage, sometimes the people would have affairs, or they will divorce, and that relationship is never again the same. For example, when you get married between 18 and the ages of 18 and 34, you get married for love. When you get married ages about 35 to 54, you get married for stability. And then if you get married after 55, it is for loneliness. And so when things come along that make that marriage difficult, it is so much easier to get divorced the second time around. You know, when you get married at 18 through 34 and you get married for love, you stick with that person for life. Even in the good times, the bad times, even in the sickness and in health. But not so much somebody who's getting married for stability when that stability is no longer there. When somebody loses their job, for instance, a wife may not want to stay in a relationship like that because she didn't get married for that agape love. And so you need to protect that first love that you have. Stick with each other no matter what. When you're asked, what is love? What do you say? Here is a child's view. Little Noel of age 7 says, love is when you tell a guy you like his shirt, then he wears it every day. Or Rebecca, aged 8, says, since my grandmother got arthritis, she can't bend over to polish her toenails anymore. So my grandfather does it for her all the time, even after his hands got arthritis too. And then Jessica, age 8, concluded, you really shouldn't say I love you unless you mean it. But if you mean it, you should say it a lot because people forget. And then God's view is the death of Christ is the measure of God's love for you. Friend, I hope that you would look towards what God has intended for love to be. I hope and pray that you will never look towards your culture, that if it is possible at all, that you will love your spouse for life and never want to look anywhere other than the one that God has provided for you.